Okay, so the purpose of today's lecture is twofold. First of all, to kind of allow you to revise some of the key issues that happened over the course of 1918 to 1923, which is a period in which the Weimar government of Germany was in a lot of trouble. But secondly, to allow you to prepare for one of the very common 16-mark questions, which could be phrased something like, the Treaty of Versailles was the main reason why Weimar Germany was in trouble during the years 1918 to 1923, to what extent do you agree? Or they could flip it on its head and say, the Weimar government was in trouble due to weaknesses of its constitution, to what extent do you agree? Or something like, the Weimar government was doomed to failure, to what extent do you agree? Now, these are all very common questions that you can very easily get your 16 marks on by putting across the consistent argument that it was actually the Treaty of Versailles that caused all of these problems. And it's quite straightforward to do that. So if you listen to this lecture today, you'll be able to link back most of the issues that took place in that period to the Treaty of Versailles, either as a cause of the issue or as something which exacerbated the issue. And exacerbated just means made worse. It's a good word to use in this essay. It exacerbated some of the other problems, thus meaning that it was the most significant problem. Now you'll find evidence in here that has nothing to do with the Treaty of Versailles or a side issue, but you can either ignore it, leave it out of the essay, or you can try and sort of work it in somehow by linking it into the Treaty of Versailles, exacerbating it. Now, the one thing I would say is be careful when you see this question on an exam paper about the dates, because sometimes I've seen it done before in a paper where they just said 1918 to 1920, which rules out things like hyperinflation and also the Munich Purge, which I'll deal with separately. So do be careful of the dates if you do get this question in the exam. But the four main things you need to focus on in that period, if it is the whole period of 18 to 23, are the Treaty of Versailles, weaknesses of the constitution, attacks from the left and right, and hyperinflation. Now there's a little lamb behind that. I wonder if any of you can remember why there might be a lamb in this presentation. So I'm going to start off by giving you a little video clip which shows the situation in Germany at the end of World War I.
Nazism, which was to create the Second World War, was born out of the First. On November the 11th, 1918, to the surprise of German frontline troops, the war suddenly stopped.
Da waren wir natürlich wütend, denn wir fühlten uns ja gar nicht geschlagen. Die Fronttruppen fühlten sich nicht besiegt. Und wir fragten uns, warum kommt der Waffenstillstand so schnell und wir müssen so schnell alle unsere Stellungen räumen, denn wir standen ja überall noch im Feindesland.
The myth grew among many of these surrendered German soldiers that they had been stabbed in the back, that the frontline troops and the 2 million German war dead had been betrayed by Marxists and Jews who had fomented dissent back at home. As these surviving troops returned to the newly democratic Germany, they took their bitterness with them.
Okay. So the old man there helped to explain a bit about how people were feeling at this point in time. They were feeling stabbed in the back. They were feeling like they couldn't understand why Germany had lost this war, because they'd seemed to be winning the war. So just to summarise the points, that they'd agreed the armistice with the Allies. That means a sort of peace agreement, bring the fighting to an end. And then people back home, sort of helped by people like General Ludendorff and extremists. These are right-wing people. We'll discuss more about what that means later. But extremists in the right wing, that they were pushing this idea that the politicians had stabbed the army in the back. And it was easy for the German people to believe it. They didn't want to believe that they'd been defeated, or that their wonderful army that they were so proud of had been defeated. And so they were looking for people to blame. And then in come far-right groups, people like the Nazis, who then link it into Jews and communists. Now, anti-Semitism was common at that sort of point in history, as it has been through a lot of history, so that helps explain why Jews. But there were a few Jewish politicians involved. And communists The Social Democratic Party was the most significant party, but that was kind of split a little bit like British Labour Party between the further left of the party and the further right of the party, and they were able to say that these kind of like more, as they would deem it, extreme leftists or communists were pushing for the surrender as a way of sort of bringing about a world revolution, because obviously the Soviet Union had just turned communist as well. So they linked it into communists and Jews in those ways. So they'd signed the armistice, the stab in the back myth was then pushed. And then this was made worse by the main point and main topic of this lecture, which is the Treaty of Versailles. So after the armistice, there's quite a big gap there. It takes a good 7 months, because it's November 1918 when the armistice is signed, and by June 1919 the German government had signed the Treaty of Versailles. So we're going to skip to that now, and then we do go back a little bit chronologically later on. But let's skip to the Treaty of Versailles now and just see what the main terms of the treaty were. And it's a nice little video clip to show you this.
The Treaty of Versailles, 1919. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles can be divided into three groups: territorial, military, and financial and economic. Here are some of the territorial terms. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria. Lands in East Germany, including the farmlands of Posen and the Polish corridor between East Germany and East Prussia, were given to Poland. The Saar, which had rich coal fields, were given to France for 15 years. All Germany's colonies were taken and given to France and Britain as mandates. Here are some of the military terms. The German army was restricted to only 100,000 men. The navy could now only have 6 battleships and no submarines, and there was to be no air force allowed. The Rhineland was demilitarized. This meant the German army could not go to this area between France and Germany. For the financial and economic terms, Germany would have to pay reparations, which would eventually be set at an enormous 132 billion gold marks. On top of this, Germany was not allowed to join the League of Nations, and it had to accept responsibility for causing all the damage and loss by the war. Overall, the Treaty of Versailles was unpopular with Germany and its creators. Its terms would go on to be reversed by Germany in both secret and in the open by Hitler, and help cause...
Move on from this, we don't want to talk about Hitler in this particular lecture. So, why did the Germans have to sign it? So, as I said, they'd lost World War I, but crucially their Kaiser, that's German for king, he had fled, and the armistice was signed by the politicians who had no choice, as I've just mentioned. France, UK and USA would have invaded if they didn't sign it, and many members of the army had also been revolting at previous points towards the end of the war. There was no way they were going to get them back on board to stop, to go back to war against France and the UK, etc. They had lost, so they had to, which kind of undermines the idea behind the stab in the back myth, hence why it's called a myth. So, it was signed, as I said, by the new government who met at a town called Weimar, and we'll talk about why they were in Weimar and not Berlin later, and it did include Jewish politicians and communist politicians, but many other politicians too, so it wasn't fair to say it was all Jews and communists that signed it.
World War II.
So what were the terms of the treaty? Now, I've written the acronym there that answers the question about why there was a lamb earlier. The acronym LAM is a nice way of trying to remember the main sections, the main 4 paragraphs that you would write if you were asked to explain the treaties, the terms of the treaty. So you do one on land, or territory, army or the military in general, money and reparations, and blame, also known as war guilt clause. So we'll talk about them all one by one here. So the first one is land. Germany lost a lot of territory in Europe, and Germany's colonies were also given to Britain and France. So let's have a look at the European territory first. So there are lots of different options for you to put into this one, but the most important and most kind of like well remembered one is the Polish corridor. Poland was given a corridor of land. So everything on there that is not green was previously owned by Germany. So you can see the yellow bit was part of Germany, which splits Germany in half when it was given away to Poland, and puts East Prussia out on a limb kind of by itself, which obviously upsets people there. But a lot of the people living in West Prussia and Posen and so on were now living under Polish rule. So that was incredibly embarrassing for them, because they saw Poland as a second-class country compared to them, great imperial Germany. So they didn't want to lose their land and their rule to Poland. So the most important one to remember is the Polish corridor. Then I would also remember Alsace-Lorraine. Little memory trick for that one. I always used to think when I was at school of like a quiche Lorraine being given over to France. And Alsace, you can remember, it's like an Alsatian. So it'll have a little dog with the person giving the quiche away. Alsace-Lorraine was given to France. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria is an important one. That's known as the Anschluss. It's an important one because it's one of the ones that Hitler goes back on. Saar coalfields was mentioned in the video. Also, the Rhineland was demilitarised. You've got to be careful with that one because it wasn't given to France as such, but it just meant that the Germans couldn't put their troops there. We'll talk a bit more about that and why that was a problem in a minute. So, in terms of the colonies, the one to remember is what's now called Tanzania. I think it was called Tanganyika at that point, but it's Tanzania now. It was probably their biggest colony, or they didn't have many colonies and they weren't very good. They weren't very wealthy or well developed, but they had colonies, and part of the reason they went to war in the first place was because they felt that they didn't have enough colonies, that is, countries they rule abroad, and so to lose the ones they had was embarrassing. Army. So the main things to remember: Germany was forbidden to have submarines or an air force, which at that era meant they were basically an ineffective, military. The navy, which they built up prior to World War One, went down to just 6 battleships, and the army, you must remember, is 100,000 men. Okay, it's a good statistic to throw in the essay. Germany is not allowed to place any troops in the Rhineland, as we've just mentioned. That was a territorial term, but it's also a military term because it makes them vulnerable, and they had to pay 6.6 billion. That is a typo, that's supposed to say dollars, not pounds. So $6,600 million in reparations for the damage done during the war. 132,000 million gold marks, if you want to put it in that currency. And Germany had to accept the blame for starting the war. That was known as Clause 231. And that's vital because it provides justification for everything else. Now, in any given essay, you can split it up into those 4 paragraphs if it's just an essay about the Treaty of Versailles. But in any given essay, when you're going to mention these things, you must refer to why it was a problem. If it's asking you to explain why people were upset with it or why Weimar Germany was in trouble, you're not going to get the marks just by saying what the terms were. You have to explain and refer back to the question. Use the words. If it was a problem, you go, this was a problem because. If it's, why were they in trouble? They were in trouble because, and then link on to the next things I'm going to talk to you about now. So these are the things to link it back to. So in terms of land, losing land meant families were separated. Many ethnic Germans living in land ruled by other countries, and Germany was split in 2 by the Polish corridor. So those living in East Prussia felt disconnected. It would have had an impact on trade, etc., etc. Okay, and it's just embarrassing for them. Losing the empire, you can just keep referring back to that word, bad, embarrassing. The army, Germany's very proud of its military. We know this. So having it reduced was another major embarrassment. It meant they couldn't defend themselves anymore. In terms of money and the reparations, Germany was financially ruined by the war and couldn't afford these reparations, so it was seen as just an awful thing, and it meant that they couldn't ever recover their country and get back to being a successful country because they had no money to invest in business or any money to look after the people. And that all gets linked into the fact that Germany didn't feel it would have started the war in the first place. So the war guilt clause was seen as very, very unfair, as it provided justification for everything else. And as we're going to talk about in a minute, it led to a worsening of the stab in the back myth.